Hello everyone, and welcome to the Exodus Seminar, episode 10. Yesterday we started walking our way through Exodus 20, which is known universally as the chapter that contains the 10 Commandments. We got through approximately the first 5. We're going to take it from the top today, concentrate on the last 6, and so away we go. Exodus 20:1. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. And with that we enter the domain of the commandments that we haven't yet discussed. Dennis, you got anything to say about thou shalt not kill?
It'll be brief. It's an incorrect translation, but I don't blame the King James people. I do blame any modern translator who translates it as do not kill. It's do not murder. Hebrew has 2 words for homicide or for killing, just as English does, kill and murder. In Hebrew, harag and ratzach. This is ratzach. It's clear it's do not murder. Murder is illegal killing. There is legal killing. You can kill an animal to eat it. You can kill a human in self-defense. So if it said do not kill, we would have to be pacifists and vegetarians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so can we delve perhaps more particularly into the distinction between murder and killing? You mentioned self-defense. I suppose that's extended under some conditions to self-defense and warfare.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as far as you're concerned, this is clearly not a call to something like pacifism or vegetarianism.
I would only correct, it's not as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, okay.
As far as the Bible's concerned.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not my read at all. And it's, again, a modern translation should not do not kill. It's do not murder.
I'm curious, when Moses kills the Egyptian, do you remember which word is used?
Neither. It was that he smote him, actually, in English. He hit him and killed him. Same with Cain and Abel. Neither word was used because neither seemed to intend to kill the other. In fact, in Cain's case, he probably didn't even know it would lead to death because he hadn't experienced it before. And in Moses' case, he simply wanted to stop the man from beating the slave. Maybe he intended to kill him, but it's not the word that's used.
So how do we reconcile the fact, for example, that there seems to be an ends justifying the means, in some sense, counter-argument lurking here? You might say, well, what makes killing in a just war not a sin? And it seems to be, please do jump in, everyone, it seems to be something like it's an action conducted in the service of something that's morally higher and superordinate in protection of that. But then that for me, opens up the thorny problem of, well, the ends justify the means. If I'm aiming at something that I regard as holy, then doesn't that open up the entire landscape of catastrophic sacrifice to me if I want to employ it? And so how do we deal with that problem? John, do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I to be honest, I've never thought about it that way. And so, I mean, there's clearly reasons to kill, like in the text, we will find reasons to kill because a lot of the laws, let's say the penalty for a lot of the sins in the text were going to be death. And so for sure in the culture of the text, it's not, like Dennis said, it's not about killing or not killing. I think it has more to do with the idea of doing it illegitimately.
Well, and so is the idea that as long as you're operating within the bounds of something like the subsidiary ethical framework, that those actions are justified. I've been thinking, for example, about vegan guilt about eating. Yeah. And so obviously our culture is rife with discussions about the morality of eating, which I think is extremely interesting. And one of the thoughts that's entered my mind, and I'm not exactly sure what to do with this, is that part of the reason that people are so guilty about what they eat is because if you do eat meat, you are killing something to sustain yourself, and that's not nothing. And we know it's not nothing from this discussion in part because we note that God includes the cattle among those who get to take a break for the Sabbath, and so there's some inclination in the text to award a certain value to, let's say, lower animals, and so you shouldn't just be obviously killing them for fun. So why is it that eating them is okay? And one answer to that is, well, you need to eat them to survive.
But you go back to Noah, it's because humans are made in the image of God. In other words, they are icons of God, and so they have a status. But I think you need to put the four together. So no murder is about life. No unfaithfulness is about the faithfulness in a family. No stealing is about property. And, no false witness about people's reputation. In other words, you've got four of the foundational pillars of a community.
Mm-hmm. Right, so these are the four basic principles together, upon which a minimal community has to be established.
Is it not right, Dennis? They're all second-person singular. They're
yes,
not
that's
generalized.
Right. And that's worthy of note briefly, the singular.
And also,
you must feel commanded. You,
each of us, individually. And also, as I understand it, there are only two words. So, thou shalt not sounds sonorous.
Right. Don't.
Hebrew, no murder.
It would be, in English, don't murder. Yeah. That way you have two words.
Right.
I remember as a boy,
don't steal,
when I was a
don't
10-year-old, the prefects would say, no talking.
Right.
That was it.
Right.
This is no murder.
Right.
No stealing. No adultery. And you've got the basic foundations of a community, civil order, and peace.
Okay, so we're going to put that line 13 or verse 13 in the context of the next four. I'll return just briefly to this idea of sacrificial eating. I mean, one of the things that might be occurring, for example, when you say grace before a meal, it seems to me that what you're doing psychologically, in some real sense, is atoning for the slaughter that constitutes the meal. And atone means at one, it means at one ment. And I think the idea is that it's now morally incumbent upon you to live your life in a manner that's as clearly moral, productive and generous, honest, and in right relationship with what's divine. It's incumbent on you because that's the only thing in some sense that can justify the sacrifice. And you're reminding yourself of that with the grace, and maybe that's also a form of expiation. I've read anthropological literature that indicates, and I don't know how accurate this is, but that many primitive tribes have a certain amount of guilt about the hunt, right? And they have a certain amount of admiration for the animals as well. They have to reconcile that feeling of guilt, which would be associated with our unwillingness to kill and our social behavior, with the fact that, well, you have to live. And then the question might be, well, under what circumstances is the terrible crime of your life, given that it requires the sacrifice of something to keep you alive, under what circumstances is that actually validly justified? I mean, people who are suicidal ask themselves that all the time. What could possibly atone for the terrible crime of my existence? And it seems that it's this integration within this subsidiary ethical structure that's I can't see a way out of that. If you're not of service to yourself, your family, your community, to whatever degree you can push past that, you're not justifying the sacrifice. Does that seem?
It seems right. Well, for sure, what you mentioned about killing animals in the text, it's not in Exodus, but in Genesis, it's presented as a condescension. The idea that we eat animals is presented after the flood. Then God says, you now have permission to eat animals. But the idea is that before the flood, they were not permitted to eat animals. So there's a sense in which it's somehow part of the fall. It's okay, it's fine, it's not wrong, but it is a kind of condescension.
And like an allowance.
Yeah,
like,
something like that.
So Dennis can tell us about the Jews, but the Greeks and the Christians, I think, view the moral bearing of an action as coming from inside the person. The virtue is in the doer, not the deed. And so Aristotle says a courageous act and every other kind of virtuous act is done for the sake of the beautiful. It matters why you do it. If you do it out of fear, it's not beautiful. And so, and that means that, and you know, the distinction between killing and murder, that's a distinction of intention. Is that the Jews? How are we doing here?
So there is a phrase in the Talmud that'll blow your minds. I think I have it right, but I don't know if I have it word for word. Better to do something because God commanded it, do a good thing because God commanded it, than because you think it is a good thing. So intent, from what you just said, would not appear to be as critical. It is to God's judgment, but to human judgment, the amount of awful things done with good intentions would have blown Aristotle's mind. 100 million people died in the name of communism, which was theoretically filled with good intentions.
So you're bringing up the thorny problem of the fact that people can feel full well that they are acting in accordance with...
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I meant well is not an excuse. When I would speak to Jewish audiences, there would be people in the audience say, you know, it's really awful, all these hospitals, they have the wing, this cancer wing named after this Jew who donated. And I go, why is that awful? I don't understand it. If my wife's cancer is cured in the Rosenberg wing, I love Rosenberg. That he wanted his name known, so what? If I pee in the Rosenberg toilet, I'm grateful to Rosenberg. I don't understand.
So is your point something like, because this is very complicated, because obviously one of the things we do when we interact with people on a day-to-day basis, and even judicially, is we do judge them on the basis of their intent. We're certainly more likely to let someone off the hook if we're convinced that they meant well than if we're convinced that they meant harm or malevolent harm. But your point is, well, so
my point is, I don't know who means malevolent harm. Roy Baumeister, I'm sure you're familiar with. I had him on my show regularly, said the people with the most self-confidence and high self-esteem were murderers in prison. Very few people wake up going, oh, I'm going to ruin somebody's life today. The Nazis thought they were doing good. The communists thought they were doing good. Everybody thinks they're doing good. I don't know anybody who wakes up and thinks I want to do evil. So therefore, I'm not an intentions man.
Like that, but I get your point. I mean, I do think there are people who set out to do harm, and I think the kid who shot up the Columbine High School, for example, he clearly set up to do harm. Right. I think it's
we might be confusing levels, because I think what Oz was pointing to is very important, is that these rules are something like objectively the manner in which people bind together. That is, the idea of not stealing, it's not just a question of morality of just tapping your fingers because you did something wrong. It's like if you steal from people, then things will break down. You won't be able to be a people if these things happen in your community. Now, then if you take this, you take it away from the community, and now you apply it as a way of life, or as a code of life, then intention definitely does matter.
Okay.
Because if
so,
you're going to transform into something more, then you can do all kinds of things that look right on the outside, but that are ultimately corrupt.
Okay. So tell me if this is what you mean. So imagine that we could say there's a set of minimal principles by which a community has to operate, and maybe those are summarized to some degree in the Ten Commandments. You could think about that as an iterable game that's playable across time that unites people psychologically and socially. And then the excuse of intention would be, you'd say, well, to the best of my ability, I was trying to abide by these principles. And then people could judge whether or not you did that successfully and whether or not they believed you. But it wouldn't just be that I felt that my intent was good. It was that I felt my intent was in accordance with, well, then it would be with something like productive tradition. And that wouldn't excuse the communists, because the communists were revolutionary enough to say, we're just going to dispense with all that, and the pure intent of our will, of our rational will, is sufficient. The Nazis would have said exactly the same thing. So is it the alignment between the tradition and the psychological intent that constitutes acceptable intent?
Well, it can't be merely exterior observance of some commandment or obligation. I mean, as we were talking about yesterday, the last commandment is a commandment about the heart, about the disposition towards one's neighbour's wife, the disposition towards one's neighbour's property. So it can't be completely irrelevant. And yes, of course, there are people who do things for the best of intentions and do terrible things for out of the best of intentions. But there are objective ways in which a community can gather around and assess whether or not that intention was as the person claimed it to be. Mm-hmm. I mean, the just war, the doctrine of just war as it develops through Augustine and Aquinas interprets this commandment as permitting war where the higher good of relieving innocent suffering is contemplated. Mm-hmm. And of course, there'll always be, as it were, reasonably foreseeable consequences where trying to relieve innocent suffering will involve the killing of the innocent, even in a wartime situation. So, yes, I think we've got to think about the interior life and intention. It can't just be, we're not utilitarians, we're not consequentialists. We don't just measure a good act by the quality of its outcome, because we would get to a situation where evil men acting from evil intentions or accidentally doing good are to be praised, and we clearly don't want to go down that route.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you looked at me, I am less interested in the interior person, morally speaking, than you are, and probably any of you are, and it's largely, I do believe, because I come from a behaviorist, law-based religion. We care how you act. That's why we don't have a claim that if you look at another woman with lust, it's as if you've committed adultery with her. I am, as I said yesterday, I thank God for America's Christians. And Maimonides said if it weren't for Christians, the world wouldn't know about the Torah. So I'm a big Christian fan. But obviously Christianity and Judaism are not identical religions. And we have no equivalent that if you look upon another woman with lust, it's as if you have committed adultery with your heart. There's only one way to commit adultery in Judaism, and it's with a different organ. And I'm not being cute. I'm being very realistic. Looking with lust is not a sin in Judaism.
What's the stance on pornography?
So pornography, when I'm asked this question...
Just to put you on the spot,
You
by the
did
way.
indeed. Okay, so my answer, when it's raised on my radio show, I have a male-female hour, and I'm very open about sexual subjects. I always ask, if a wife calls me and says, my husband looks at pornography, I found on his computer, I have one question. How is your life of intimacy with your husband? Is it good? In other words, is the pornography in lieu of you or in addition to you? Mm-hmm. And I know this is not a religious answer, mm-hmm. and I'm not even giving a religious answer. I'm giving mm-hmm. what I think is a moral and realistic answer. Men want variety. And if adultery is a substitute if pornography is a substitute for one's wife, it's awful. If it's a substitute for adultery, it's not awful. That is my unpredictable answer.
Well, there is a clinical rule of thumb that's akin to that, I would say. If you're trying to decide clinically whether someone's partaking in a habit, say use of alcohol, has reached the threshold of clinical significance, one of the things you do is ask, the person you're assessing. Now, is it interfering with your employment? Has it got you in trouble with the law? Is your family complaining? Does it stop you from doing other things that you should be doing? And so the judgment isn't the use of the forbidden substance itself. It is in some sense consequentialist. And I'm not saying that that's an absolute, but it is a hallmark of clinical judgment.
But Dennis, you're making, I think, too big a gap between, behavior and where it comes from. And surely the 10th commandment is exactly that. You could expound everything Jesus said from thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or another woman you're not whatever. Mm-hmm.
Well,
the whole point of coveting, it begins in the heart. And I understand your Hebrew word for covet is a desire that doesn't stop halfway.
Right, to take.
It takes action.
It's to take.
Yeah.
It's not. There's no ban in the 613 laws of the Torah on lusting. I don't even know there's a ta'ava is the closest you could get to lust in Hebrew. But
okay. Okay, so let me ask you about that.
The covet is critical. I can be attracted to my neighbor's wife. I can't want her. There's a difference because but what about a single woman? I asked one of the great Protestant thinkers of our generation in a public debate in Phoenix. I asked them, so can a single Christian male look upon a single woman with lust? He can't be committing adultery. He's not married and she's not married. So is the real ban lust or is the ban on adultery?
Yeah. I mean, at least for me, when I hear all of this from my own Orthodox perspective, it's bewildering because at least from the tradition in which I am, it's not a morality question. Even the word morality, it bothers me. At least in the Christian tradition that I participate in, the call is to be transformed. The call is to be free. That's the call. Christ is calling us to be free. And so the idea of like, can you lust or can't you lust or can you do this or not this? The answer is we have desires in us, and these desires tend to enslave us. They tend to pull us into themselves. And these laws are exterior ways for you to understand how it is that you can now be free from these desires. None of the desires are wrong. Like sexual desire isn't wrong, desire to eat isn't wrong, none of these things are wrong. The problem is when they capture you.
The subordination.
Right, and so it's not about like trying to figure out if I'm sinning or not sinning. Like if I go to confession, I ask forgiveness for all the sins I've done, voluntary and involuntary. It's like I'm sinning all the time. If you want to know, like every all day long I'm sinning. But
that's why you're so much fun.
That's why I'm so much fun. But the idea is rather that to attend to my desires in the sense so that I'm not captured by them, so that I don't become obsessed, so that I don't fall into that. So to me, like the question of like legally trying to figure out like where I'm sinning or where I'm not, it's just like it pulls me into a world that
So if a man has, and I know this case, I know a man who was saintly in taking care of his Alzheimer's wife, who got Alzheimer's at the young age of 50, and watched over her and bathed her for a decade. And then, so I would just ask, you asked me about pornography. So this man was faithful to a wife with whom he could not have relations, obviously, for a decade or more. I think it went to 15 years. Would he have been wrong in relieving his sexual tension with a photograph?
See, I'm wondering if it's this, Dennis, maybe, and this is something that I had talked to people in my clinical practice about. So imagine there's and I guess we're into thou shalt not commit adultery, by the way, which is the next commandment. You can imagine an erotic image that compels sexual desire, and I think that's part of what we're discussing, the morality of that, or its potential to be an implement to the instantiation of an ideal. You can imagine a situation where your desire is to sleep with your neighbor's wife. You're not acting on it, but the reason you're not acting on it is because she doesn't want to sleep with you. Now, it still seems to me that given that your desire is to undertake the act, and the only reason that you're not able to manage it has nothing to do with your moral stance, it has to do with the impossibility of the action. Now, given it's, I don't know how you would deal with that because
that's a violation of do not covet. He's coveting his neighbor's wife. It's clear as a bell.
Here's a point worth making. There's a great gulf between the Ten Commandments and the Christian faith in this way. First of all, by the way, the Ten Commandments are painfully obvious, aren't they? Doesn't everybody know that before the tablets? But I had a great teacher. Most of my great teachers were Jews. Dennis will say maybe that's why I know things. But
I wouldn't say that.
I do. But there's a great man. He's dead now. His name was Harry Newman, and he styled himself a nihilist. And we would argue with him about that all the time, and he was a very, very learned man and a great teacher. And so sometimes when he wanted to put the point that he's a nihilist, he would say, I'm a non-practicing Orthodox Jew. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that emphasizes the point that it is a set of practices more than a set of beliefs. Mm-hmm. Whereas Christianity is more a set of beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Well, these four are beliefs, behaviors, aren't they? And they're pretty well universal.
Yeah.
Almost all societies would agree with these four, but thou shalt not covet is innovative. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm intrigued. You have René Girard, as you know, everything based on mimesis. In other words, we desire what other people desire. And I read Girard, the whole of American consumerism is based on mimesis, is it not? We are taught to desire what other people desire, want to wear what you wear, or
well, it's a good way. It is a good way of figuring out what's of value. Because that is an open question. There's many things you could value, and one way of becoming informed about that is to see what everyone else values. And so I'm trying to strip the morality out of that to some degree. That can become weaponized, and it can become pathological.
But so to go back to Larry's friend, or Larry's teacher, there's got to be, even if you're committing yourself to certain exterior practices or habits or behaviors on the basis of, say, command, there's got to be some prior belief, prior commitment into the authority of the person or the source of these commands. So there's got to be some kind of...
one question that...
Well, you've got to believe that they're...
in society they wouldn't agree with those four.
No, but, let's say it doesn't matter where the source of authority might come from. It might be one's conscience, that the nihilist is still going to accept that there is some degree... The nihilist who conforms to these behaviours is going to be acting on something, not nothing.
I'd like to challenge Larry's supposition, just for the sake of discussion. Are these self-evident? And I would say they're not exactly self-evident to psychopaths, right? So the self-evidence argument's a really interesting one, because you could add the psychopathy twist to all of these. It would be, well, thou shalt not kill unless you can get away with it, and it works in your favor. The same with adultery, the same with stealing. And the question there would be something like, well, why shouldn't I do this if I can get away with it? And that is really the question the psychopath asks, the narcissist, the Machiavellian, that sort of people. Now, we could make two arguments here. We could say that any society that enables itself to play out across time, that maintains a certain degree of stability and productivity, would eventually circulate around a set of principles, actions that would bear some resemblance to this. And that's a discussion we could have. Do we believe at this table, for example, that these 10 principles, which are elaborated into a much more differentiated law, are these 10 principles the necessary minimal preconditions for a society that offers its people some degree of psychological unity and hope, and simultaneously some possibility of maintainable social unity? And if they are the necessary principles, is that stable enough, that fact, so that that's somehow imbued on our soul? Well, you might say yes for normal people and no for psychopaths, or you might also say, well, maybe it's not so obvious. There is a mystery in the anthropological literature, which is for about 300, we've had our modern genetic form in principle for about 350,000 years. A lot of human history looked like pretty bloody, dismal, backstabbing, murderous tribalism for almost that entire period. And it's not obvious at all how we got out of that. And so I'm wondering, well, we certainly degenerate back into it very easily. And so is it the case that
But you don't have to say the whole 10 are universal, do you?
I don't know.
No, I would
don't
argue
know.
just immediately, these 4 are almost universal. Yeah. And if you don't practice them, you have chaos in society. But the Sabbath is not universal. Right. Honor your parents is innovative.
Well, but I mean, do all societies that are stable even follow these 4? I mean, if you think about, well, how about North Korea? I mean, obviously, we don't. It's been. That's a good question. I don't believe that it's viable in any reasonable span of time either, but it's lasted as long as it has lasted, and you do get tyrannies that emerge and dominate for some period of time.
In the classic books, Book 5, Aristotle's Politics, how does a tyranny survive? The answer is they don't, because people don't like it. But if they do it by corrupting their people.
Or enslaving them.
Well, there can be no. But
centuries?
If you enslave them, it's hard to have enough people to do enforcement over a whole country.
Right.
So slavery is for a minority.
It's easier with weapons.
But it's I mean, like, what is the list? It's just chilling. It's in Book 5 of Aristotle's Politics. There can't be any friendship. Mm-hmm. There can't be any confidentiality in private. Mm-hmm. People have to be in public places as much as possible where they can be seen. Mm-hmm. And you know, this is all summarized in a story that Aristotle repeats, which is first in Herodotus, about a young tyrant sending a messenger to an old tyrant. How did you last so long? And the old tyrant doesn't say anything. He's walking through a wheat field and he's got a sickle and he starts chopping off the tops of the taller heads of grain. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the messenger goes back and says, "You didn't say anything." Mm-hmm. And he said, "What did he do?" And the young tyrant understands.
Right.
See, because, like you know, I mean, I think the American government is turning against the sources of privacy or individuality mm-hmm. in the American people. Mm-hmm. Because if you raise a family, if you make your own business, if you do your own learning, then that marks you out. And that means that you're authority. I mean, why did Adolf Hitler hate the Jews? Transnational, eternal people. Mm-hmm. But he hated
successful generally.
But he hated the Christians too, you see, because they claimed a source of authority beyond him. Mm-hmm. And that tyrants don't like that, see. Anything transcendent has got to be destroyed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe that's what explains, just going back to Oz's point about these 4 commandments being universal. I mean, we can accept that they are universal. I mean, I think they are actually on the Code of Hammurabi, which is what, the 18th century BC, and there are other similar kind of legal codes. But the difference there is that the commandment is being issued by the king, by the tyrant. Whereas here you've got, as we're reminded in the Sabbath commandment, they're coming from the source, the creator, the source of the moral order.
So it's like they're written on your soul.
So there's something, so it's only gathering a special strength, I suppose, as they're pronounced in this context.
There's another huge difference. The Code of Hammurabi has 3 classes.
That's right.
The aristocracy, yes. The ordinary people,
and the slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whereas here, the whole people agree to it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And the covenant applies to the whole people.
As we'll see further down.
James, I'd like to develop that argument that you just put forward more too, because the problem with it being from the king is that means that the source of the morality itself is from the king. And then you might say, well, what happens then if the king dies? And well, if the source of authority is the king, then if the king dies, there's no source of authority. What's happening here psychologically, at least to some degree, and it's quite something remarkable, it isn't only happening with the Hebrew people at this time, is that the principle of sovereignty itself is being divorced from the instantiation of that sovereignty in any one person. And people are trying to work out, well, what is it that we should be subordinate to in principle, including our kings, including our rulers, even to extend to slaves, even to extend to animals. And if you're a skeptic about that, you say, well, what's the use of having a God? Let's say, why do we need that? And the answer is, well, is it more sophisticated to start abstracting up the principle of sovereignty into something like a spiritual principle? Or is it more sophisticated to leave it instantiated in the body of a king? And I think anybody who's sensible, who's modern, would say, well, it's not obvious to us, to any of us, that we should instantiate the highest possible principles in any given like, let's say, earthly ruler. That's not a sophisticated solution to the problem. And then that begs the question, which is, well, if sovereignty is an independent principle that's superordinate, what's the nature of that sovereign spirit? And of course, that's partly what we're investigating in the seminar.
So in the ancient world, the parts I know about, and I don't know much about Hammurabi, I'd be astonished if Hammurabi said, it's because I say this, that this is the case, right? Because that, obviously, if a claim that this is so will run up against the reality of it, and it'll either reinforce that reality or it will be subject to refutation by reality. See, I think all of this, I think these beautiful things in the Ten Commandments, see, here am I talking for Dennis now, right? Because he lives this life and knows it very well. But as I say, most of my teachers are Jews. These are like, in this text, like the detailed commands that seem boring to everybody. And what Leon Kass says about this, another Jewish teacher of mine, whose book, by the way, Founding, what's the name of it?
God's Nation.
Founding God's Nation. It's just a wonderful book. Have you read that book, Dennis?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you like it?
I've had him on, and look, he's terrific. Do we agree on everything? We're two Jews.
Yeah. Churchill said, wherever there are 3 Jews, there are 2 prime ministers and 1 leader of the opposition.
Oh, that's very funny. I never heard that one.
But the point is, these poor people are being marked out for a demonstration of God's providence. And it's hard duty. And they have to demonstrate visibly in public so we can see, right? And then when they fall short, we can see that too. And there are punishments for that. It's, the worst thing that can befall a people is to get chosen.
Well, we could also point out, too, is that people have a real hard time often with the idea that God would choose a people to lead, let's say. And one of the things I'd like to say in favor of that idea is that, well, ideas have to start with a few people somewhere. Right? It's not like you can have a revelatory idea and then everyone has access to it instantaneously, like that second. It has to begin somewhere. Now, but that also introduces us to a contradiction in what we've put forward here, too, because we're trying to argue, in some sense, for a moral universalism, and we're also trying to argue for a Hebrew exceptionalism simultaneously. And the exceptionalism seems to be maybe partly that to the degree to which this is made explicit and to the degree to which, to some degree, it's psychologized in such things as thou shalt not covet. I mean, the ancient Mesopotamians, earlier than this, I would say, or perhaps at about the same time, they had already worked through the idea that sovereignty was separate from the emperor, in that for the Mesopotamians, the emperor was only sovereign insofar as he properly incarnated Marduk. And Marduk had eyes all the way around his head, so he could see everywhere, and he could speak magic words. So they had a doctrine of the word in some sense. And the notion there was that, well, you got to be sovereign only insofar as you were an embodiment of Marduk, and the principle of sovereignty itself had been abstracted up into the realm of the gods. So obviously other societies in the Middle East at about the same time period were starting to move towards this notion of sovereignty as a principle that wasn't merely a manifestation of the state.
Jordan, you keep talking, and I may be misunderstanding you, so forgive me. But as if human ideas are working their way up, and the Hebrews sort of got higher than anyone else with this brilliant idea. And surely the whole point of Exodus is they encountered a God who was transcendent and different. And that notion, you must be holy as I'm holy. Well, the essence is I'm set apart from all the other gods. I think
that your comment and criticism is accurate, but I'm wondering, see, to me what's happening is something is reaching up from below and descending from above at the same time. And so let me give you an example of that that's maybe within the text. So remember now, before Moses has his revelation, before he receives this revelation, he sits and judges the people for, well, we don't know how long, years, enough to wear him out. And so you could imagine that he's been exposing himself to all this conflict between the Israelites.
But he doesn't meet God at Sinai. He meets God at the burning bush. In other words, that's
right, but God descends with the rules at Sinai, and but to me that means that Moses has been prepared to receive this revelation by the fact that he has observed the principles by which a people must govern themselves in painful detail for decades. And so, because we also have the question as well, why would Moses be the one to receive the revelation? And I would say, well, he's in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. And I do see this bottom-up yearning towards the divine, let's say, making itself manifest at the same time that the divine is reaching down to deliver the revelation. It's still the case that when Moses gets the rules, it's a revelation, and it's a codified revelation, but the ground is prepared because the Israelites, he's already spent a lot of time organizing the Israelites so that to the degree that they're peaceful and already a nation, they're kind of doing this already. They don't know it. It's still locked in procedure. It's not explicit.
The reach down starts with Abraham.
Okay.
And I would just challenge you to put the descent as strongly as the ascent, always.
Right.
That's fine. I mean, I agree, but I understand why Jordan is trying to formulate it that way, because I would say historically, and what we've noticed in the past few years is that when we formulate it bottom up for people, they get it. And it's as if people have become so blind to what it means to have vertical revelation. As soon as they hear that, they think superstition, and they stop listening. But if we can show what people call emergent properties, which I still believe come from above, but if you can show it and show people how it works and how these things gather together, then it's as if people, for some reason, now they understand, and they're more susceptible to then hear about, well, then now we can say you can formulate it the other way around now. You can say that these principles constrain reality and act upon it that way.
And you can also say, well, there's a moral striving that emerges from the bottom up as mankind aggregates itself into larger and more sophisticated cooperating and competing groups. But that fleshes out a pattern that's implicit in being itself, and that's there in the beginning, and that's the same in some real sense as it descending from on high. And it's like we're investigating only the pattern of possible forms. It's not some mere arbitrary moral horizon. It's a moral horizon that has an implicit and a priori structure.
But it's not arbitrary. That's it. It's what you're discovering, that this is how God created the world. God created the world. These are the actual forms that God created. The things that he's saying are not arbitrary. They are revealing the patterns of reality. And so it is possible, like you said, to notice the inklings, the yearning, the searching, and to see people kind of grasp at it and find, let's say, fragmentary versions of it. And then at some point it clicks and it joins together.
Yeah.
That is the revelation.
Maybe we're just being too constrictive in how we understand the notion of revelation as something that's only, as it were, coming from above down below. And there's a very sort of natural tradition in, I think, all three Abrahamic monotheisms that revelation can, as it were, operate within the human heart, that God inscribes certain,
St. Paul
certain instincts. You're thinking here Romans 1 and Romans 2. That's a sort of very straightforward thought, and that is the sort of sometimes called the candle of the Lord, or sort of that conscience, as it were, is a form of revelation, you might say, more muted, maybe more indirect, more kind of blurred.
Well, Justin Martyr called the ancient Greeks Christians before Christ.
Right.
I mean, he used that term.
Yeah.
And there's also other monotheisms. We tend to really focus on the Abrahamic tradition, but there's also Mazdaism, is what we call Zoroastrianism today, is a very ancient form of monotheism which existed prior to, happening at the same time. Exactly, yeah.
I mean, surely in some sense the whole notion of revelation, the whole notion of giving laws at all rests fundamentally on the idea that those to whom that is given are already something that can internalize and take that on. Otherwise, it's just it's just chaotic sound, or the law itself is incoherent unless we are already something that can take on the law. I'm just wondering if I've got a simple question. In some sense, yesterday we talked about the first four commandments are sort of our relation to God, and then, or let's say to the divine, and then the last 5 are sort of our relation to each other. In some sense, the giving of the law is the constituting of a community of faith or belief or practice. And the honor the father and mother, we said, is the kind of the fulcrum of those, because in some sense it's you move from God to the world in which you are embedded. There's a history there that has an objectivity that you have to honor in relation, and then you come into the present of the current community with "Thou shalt not kill" or murder. Thank you, Dennis. In some sense, is like there is no human community at all if there's chaotic random killing. I mean, it's totally it's like the beginning point of any stable community has to be that, because there's no life. You can't.
There's no community if you eat each other.
Well, exactly. And so the other ones are going to be further elaborations of what life can be if you have it. But why is the next one, "Thou shalt not commit adultery"? I mean, and just to ask the simple question, why does that matter?
Well, you might say, if you're a biologist, you'd say, well, survival and reproduction. I mean, those are the two fundamental, what would you say, necessities of propagating life.
But you can reproduce perfectly well through adultery.
Not if you get killed for doing it. Or if children get killed.
Not if you're married.
Yeah. Well, so they might be. So are you saying these are the two most fundamental? Well, you might say the most fundamental principles would have to regulate survival and also to regulate reproduction. That would make sense.
Is this a regulation of family? Is this a protection of family as primordial unit?
Family integrity, property, and reputation, and they're all very fundamental.
Mm-hmm. If you read these, I mean, they do seem obvious, and then you read them in the setting, and what comes before is they're handed down from God and presented to the people. Moses actually assumes his leadership fully when he destroys them, and then has to make them again. But then what follows is rules beyond the telling. Well, actually, Dennis can tell you how many. 600 and some. 613. See, it's a good thing to know that. And there's 600, and these are like those are like these. Those are special commands to this people who are picked to demonstrate them. And if you look at the arguments on the fields of battle of the Jews, of the Israelites, when the Greeks fought each other, they would pray to their own gods, and then they'd have a contest, and they'd see whose gods was the strongest. Well, it's like that in the Old Testament, in the Bible, as we say, but it's different too, because our God is the only God, right? And that claim, that's revolutionary in ancient times.
I don't think that claim is being made in the Ten Commandments, because when he says there's plenty of gods, the gods are there.
You have to read this in light of that. This is the God, and these are my people, but I'm still everybody's God, right?
Yeah, he's the transcendent God.
That's it.
And then there are lower gods, like angels and all these other beings.
There are lower gods in reality, in the human reality, but they're not really gods.
Well, they're
things that are worshipped.
It's a contentious point that I've noticed has been kind of hovering in the background. We've not really settled it. Are we committed to the idea of henotheism, the idea that there's a God, Yahweh, the God of Exodus 3:14 is the top God, but there are, in reality, not just in our human reality, our human imaginations, actual gods? Or are we saying this is...
You mean in the eyes of the Bible, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of Moses?
All of those, in some sense.
So one by one, it's a very fair question, but analyzing it, so do we entertain the idea that God himself, the creator of the universe of Genesis 1:1, believes there are other gods, or believes that there are things that people worship and call gods?
That frames the dilemma nicely. Is it the first or the second? Is it henotheism or monotheism? So there are principalities and powers.
I think the Bible is monotheistic.
That's what
I'm totally with you, Dennis.
Yeah, I know you.
And I know the philosophers of religion make this distinction. But I think the biblical view, the Lord alone is God.
Yeah.
And Calvin's idea, the human heart is a forge of idols.
Well, the angels are named gods in the Bible by the text.
Principalities and powers of Paul.
No, but even the word.
Yeah,
the
but
word
as Dennis said, people believe in those things. They do today. Reason.
No, but the angels
science.
that God sends are called gods.
By whom?
I mean, the angels that are in God's service are used. Sometimes they use the same word.
I don't know that that's so in the Hebrew Bible. They're not called gods. The Jews were not always monotheistic.
What about the people who were sent to Abraham? The
yes,
angels.
So they were angels. That's correct.
Right, but they're on a
divine mission.
Right. So what are they?
Hebrew has no word for angel. What's called angel, malach, is messenger. They're God's messengers.
Mm-hmm. That's what angel means too in Greek.
Yeah.
So is it in the book of Revelation? You guys will know. Where somebody's going to bow down before emissaries from God, and the command is, "See thou do it not. I am fellow servant." You see? So I think this one God, I think that, and see, it doesn't make as much sense of the universe if there are many gods. Right. You know, in Aristotle and Plato, they're not many gods, right?
I guess, well, then we're faced with a thorny problem under those circumstances is of how we conceptualize transcendent spirits that aren't reflective of the ultimate unity. So what do I mean by that? Well, we could take, this is an oversimplification, but we could take a god like Ares, god of war, say, and I'll do a biological reading of that. You can be ruled by anger. And you might say, well, yeah, but that's not a god. And I say, well, yeah, let's just hold on about that. First of all, it's not only localized in you, it's everywhere. Like the rage in your heart is the same as the rage in your heart and in your heart and in mine. It's maybe the same, or it's a variant on a theme, and it's the same force that could rage in an animal. It's tens of millions of years old. It's a pattern of neurological activation, you might say embodied activation, that's transcendent and immortal, and it can certainly rule you. And it has an ambivalent relationship to something that's transcendent, non-biological, because it fleshes out part of the implicate order. And so, like, is rage a god? Is lust a god? Is fear a god? And I mean, those have they have been deified in many cultures. You certainly have gods of Eros in all sorts of cultures, because that fundamental motivational force, which is a spirit that abides within, but that's also transcendent.
Are they God in the biblical sense? I would say.
Well, I don't know.
They would be idols.
No.
Well,
but
yes and no, because they also have a reality.
They're
right?
higher than us.
Yes.
In the book of Daniel, it becomes semantics. Like it's semantics.
I think we are at semantics.
I think we're at semantics here.
No.
So you believe that there are principalities that act upon us that are beyond human scale, but you don't like that we call them gods, let's say.
No, we may call them gods. We may call them gods, but they're not God.
But they have existence.
Yes, that's
supernatural.
But
then we're fine.
There are supernatural powers.
Okay, so basically,
it's just the word. We don't like the fact that we use the word God.
Then we are agreeing in some sense that we're going to reserve the term God for the unity.
That's fine. We can use principality for the
in a broad sense, everybody around this table is a child of the Bible.
Fine.
And that means we don't like to call many things God.
Right. I guess my objection was whether we call them gods or not, they have a proclivity to act like deities.
Oh, absolutely.
And
that's the biblical view of idols, though.
Yes. Well,
powers in which we're making our...
But it's deeper than that in some sense, because you could think of an idol as just an arbitrary human construction. But what I would say instead, it's not. It's the raising of a principality to the highest place. And so you say, well, my God is Priapus, let's say. And many people say that now. In fact, it's almost mandatory to say that.
But less than the highest place.
Right.
Because
well, it's in
God.
Yes, you could imagine demonic agencies being recognized by Satanists as God, as something they would bow down before.
It's the raised to the highest place, and that's what we're objecting to.
And there's no disagreement.
I don't know. I want to know, Dennis, what do you think? Like, do you have a sense of the notion of principalities or demons? Is this something that you entertain in your worldview?
So
we're giving you the hard questions today, Dennis.
Yes, indeed, and I'm honored. Is it your Dennis or your?
Well,
as I understand,
you're
Jewish.
Here, so I'm asking you, and you can answer the way you want to answer.
I'm a strict monotheist. There's one God, end of issue. There are no demons. Even I will say though, to my own shock, the last years in the Western world have opened me up for the first time to the belief that there may be a devil.
They're walking around. The demons are walking around in the street now.
I'm not kidding. I wish I were. There's no levity to what I'm saying, but it is almost impossible to explain the rejection of what is good and the celebration of what is wrong so radically and so quickly without recourse to some other force in the universe. And I don't believe it because Jews believe, unlike Zoroastrianism, where there are two gods, a good God and a bad God, where there is Satan is only in Job in the Hebrew Bible, and it only means opponent, yes, adversary, yes.
But Dennis, Book of Daniel, you have the princes and so on. They're supernatural. I agree with you. There's only one God.
Right.
But the supernatural powers higher than human powers.
So let me.
I have to explore that.
Let me riff on that for a second. So here's a way of conceptualizing it. Well, let's do this biologically again. So we can take something like anger or lust, and you might, like psychologists tend to conceptualize those as drives, or reflexes or instincts. It's a poor conceptualization, and here's why. And I mean this scientifically. A fundamental motivational force that's transcendent, so it's shared by all humans, it's shared by all mammals, let's say, it's shared by reptiles for that matter, like it's archaic. Lust would be that, anger would be that, fear would be that, pain. Those are best conceptualized as personalities. And why do I say that? It's because they have a viewpoint, they have a telos, they frame emotions. Like the best way to think about anger is a personality, and you know that perfectly well. If you get very irritated when you're arguing with someone and you're possessed by the spirit of anger, it changes your perceptions, it changes your emotions, it changes your view of the future, your view of the past. It's a fragmentary sub-personality that then takes over the whole. And then you could imagine that a malevolent sub-personality, so for all intents and purposes a demon, is an aggregate of those fundamental sub-personalities that's integrated in a manner that's very, very powerful and that partakes of that motivational force. Maybe you're angry and afraid and resentful and lustful all at the same time, and that's it. It's like a very high-order malevolent spirit has got you in its grip. And there is a reality to that. Now, we wouldn't want to say that if we're going to reserve the term God for the highest possible unity, it's definitely not that. But it's certainly it's a transcendent principality, and it is a spirit and a personality.
But the way you frame that, Jordan, is still basically metaphorical, isn't it? This is still, you talk about being possessed.
I don't think so.
I mean, the tradition, I mean, certainly the Christian tradition has demons. Demons have agency.
But those demons are allied very closely to our passions.
Sure.
They're almost like a cosmic version of the local passion.
And there are certain ways in which, through the kind of free agency of the individual, they could kind of admit they can conduct themselves in a way that makes them more vulnerable to those kind of external agencies.
Well, they open the door to it.
But would you accept that, Jordan? You would accept that there are, as it were, extrinsic sources that are going to operate on the psychological structures of an agent, in addition to the kind of cumulative weight of all the bad decisions.
It's microcosm, macrocosm. Yeah. You have to see the human person as a microcosm, and then these cosmic forces. So we are.
Okay. Was that what Jordan was setting out?
I think.
Yeah, you're comfortable with that.
So.
Okay.
Well, it is complicated too, because so imagine that you're possessed by an aggregate of these motivational states.
Okay. Well, because then you're saying motivational states.
Well,
so that okay.
Let me elaborate it one bit further, though, because you could also imagine that there are culturally developed manners in which that aggregate has expressed itself. So, for example, let's take the Columbine killer, for example. So I read his writings, and I put myself in his position, let's say, that brooding position on evil. So he allowed himself to be possessed by a set of motivational states, one of which was certainly covetousness, certainly resentment, hatred, powerful dark motivations. But the manner in which that manifested itself also had a culturally conditioned element, right? I mean, there's a satanic element to it that's like, it's like satanic in the poetic
kind of mimesis of malice.
Sense. Exactly that. Yeah. And you see this, you really see this with the mass slayers, because they compete with one another. So there's a subculture of high school shooters underground, and they know of each other, and they try to outdo each other. And so and that's a mimesis
of sorts. But Jordan, would you go one further? You're going individual, cultural, microcosm, macrocosm. Would you go natural, supernatural?
Well,
I think that's still a distinction between the way you put it out, Jordan, and the way that...
Okay, well, but then I would also say, this is where it gets very complicated, is that malevolence that's a combination of bottom-up biological motivation and then cultural elaboration,
cultural mimetic
also
effects.
a reflection of some cosmic form. I think it is.
Okay, great. We're agreed. Okay.
Wait. You're not agreeing.
I am agreeing.
I was agreeing with you because you weren't agreeing with him.
I wanted to tease out the tension
I don't
between
understand.
these two.
How is it...
Well, I think it's...
We don't produce anger. We don't produce lust. They're outside of us?
No, we're not saying that.
Well, I thought, then I don't understand what's being said.
I mean, a simple way to say it is that anger in you is similar to anger in Stephen or in me. And because it's similar, there's a being that's a... It's hard.
Anger exists even if you die.
That's right. There's a good way to say it. That's right.
Right. Anger is something that grips you. And so it's got a reality that transcends you.
Then how do I control it? Why am I responsible? If I act out evilly in anger and anger controls me, I have an excuse.
Well, my answer to that would be
it's the bottom up and top down thing.
I don't know exactly what to say about that, apart from the fact that there are other forces within you, including you, that give you the ability to control it, even if it has some autonomy of its own. Like, you don't have to give yourself over to anger, even though it beckons to you. You know, and you remember in the story of Cain and Abel, you think about how that sets itself up. So Cain is resentful and bitter and angry. And the reason for that is his sacrifices are rejected. And then sin sits at his door. Like it's externalized as a tempting spirit, and he has to invite it in. You know, it's the same idea in stories of vampiric possession, as you have to invite the vampire through the window. So I would say you can open yourself up to this possession or decide not to do it. And there's an element of free choice in that for sure. And this is why God calls Cain out. And the Cain and Abel story is very ambivalent in some way, because it isn't exactly obvious why God rejects Cain's sacrifices. And I love that about the story, because people fail in life and it's not exactly obvious why. And they get bitter and resentful about it. And then you might say, well, does that justify, because they're hurt so badly, because they've failed, does that justify their vengefulness? And the Cain and Abel story says, no, it sets them up for it. That spirit of sin approaches them, but they still decide whether or not they're going to open the door.
Doesn't it say that he brought an inferior sacrifice?
Yes, but
so
it
does explain why God preferred
No, it
Abel's.
doesn't exactly say that, Dennis. It says that Abel's sacrifice is of the highest quality.
Yes.
And it implies that Cain is lesser. But it never really explains what he's doing wrong.
It doesn't have to.
Well,
it's an inferior sacrifice. That's the end of the issue. And then he got angry that his brother, who did in fact bring a superior sacrifice, was recognized as such by God, and he got angry at that. Which is what people who do inferior things always feel about people who do better things. They get angry at them.
What leaves you with a problem is that you see people who fail frequently, ill children. They fail, and it isn't obvious that their sacrifice is insufficient, right? So there's this problem in life where cataclysmic things can befall you, and your culpability isn't self-evident. But the moral of the story in the Cain and Abel story, in some sense, is that even if, regardless of why your sacrifice is rejected, it's not morally appropriate for you to open the door to possession by the spirit of sin that sits on the doorway. And I think the ambivalence in the story is actually extremely useful, because sometimes you fail for reasons that aren't obvious, right? You think, well, maybe my sacrifice wasn't of the highest quality, but I don't know why and I don't know how, and I failed and it's bitter, And aren't I justified now? And the answer is not even under those circumstances are you justified.
But Dennis, you almost said if there's any force outside us, it's nothing to do with us. We're non-responsible. Yeah. And we're surely saying it's both and. We are fully responsible, but there is something there. And I keep harping on this for a simple reason.
That's the word cosmic that
well, let me explain why I keep harping back on this.
Well, it should trouble you. It should trouble you.
In my first days at Christ Church with tutors at Oxford, everything was reductionism, following Feuerbach. God himself is a projection. And my whole psychological, sociological training was reductionism again and again. So I'm trying to resist that, saying it's always both and. God reveals, and we hear, etc.
Yeah. That's why you want all those gods in there.
Absolute justice to both of them.
That's why all this is such a mess, right? Because God doesn't have all this trouble with the cattle. They're ruled by instinct. They do the right thing all the time. Whereas it's us. We're the problem, right? We have a will of our own, and that doesn't mean that we're not subject to powerful outside forces. Certainly, the testimony here is there's at least one powerful outside force, and we may not listen to that.
Well, one of the ways I think of bringing this into kind of sharp relief, the commandments, is asking, well, what happens if you don't follow it, right? And we said yesterday with, have no other gods before me, and Jordan, you were so helpful in describing how if you don't have, subordinate yourself to a single unified higher principle, then, everything is chaos. If you don't keep the Sabbath, well, you lose sight of that principle, and you lose yourself in day-to-day instrumentality. But I'm wondering if we can ask this question as we work through the remaining commandments. Like, in some sense, thou shalt not kill. I think Larry is right. It is obvious. Not that people don't kill, but the result of killing randomly is very palpably clear to any human being. I would say any basically well put together human being. But I think it might be somewhat helpful, and maybe sort of as one thinks, and indeed about our listeners, on to this wonderful chance that we have to talk this through. What have we observed as the effects in life of adultery, and then theft, bearing false witness, etc.?
Well, you talked about reproduction. I mean, if you think about reproduction as more than the reproductive act, if you think about it as a medium to long-term strategy that has to be played out in the social world, so for example, you don't want people to kill your children, then you might say, well, there's a pattern of sexual interaction that has to make itself manifest that works across multiple contexts and multiple people. And maybe the core of that is, thou shalt not commit adultery. It's like you can't let your sexual desire be as wanton as random murder might be, for example. It's not a tenable and iterable social solution. Everything taken into account.
Well, I've certainly seen it really mess up families. I mean, just
yes.
and
then you compromise children. Well, we know that. We know that
Yeah.
already. That as the family breaks down under the weight of, well, I would say sexual hedonism primarily and irresponsibility, that the very capacity to reproduce is minimized, is reduced to a tremendous degree. Look at the birth rate. And
in an anthropological or even an evolutionary context, I think I've heard you make this point before, Jordan. It confuses paternity. This is natural tribal societies. So it where it cuts adultery sort of by introducing this sense of uncertainty about paternity. As it were, it cuts the victim off from future generations. It completely destabilizes the kind of diachronic order of a society.
It reduces, then it's going to reduce paternal commitment.
Right.
And humans have this immensely long developmental dependency. And so if you reduce paternal commitment, you reduce reproductive fitness. And I think that's quite clear.
Maternal vulnerability.
Surely the answer to your question, though, Stephen, is Hobbes. In other words, Leviathan is the answer to what you are saying. Life, if we flout all four of those, will be nasty, brutish, and short. The war of all against all, and we'll be prepared to give up our freedom for what he calls a mortal god, Leviathan, to give us peace.
This
is the alternative.
In the Mesopotamian creation story, that's exactly what's laid out, is that Hobbesian nightmare, is that creation rebels against the implicate order in the Mesopotamian creation story, and what happens is a terrible monster, which is the same thing as the Leviathan, symbolically speaking. It comes from exactly the same roots. The Leviathan, it's Tiamat, and that's Teom, by the way, comes back to wreak havoc. And so the notion is exactly, chaos is that if we destroy the implicate order, and that's the implicate cosmic order, and then you say, well, if there is an implicate cosmic order, there's an implicate cosmic disorder, and that would be associated in some sense with the principalities of evil. It has to be that way.
But again, where we started with Exodus. Exodus is ordered freedom between anarchy, all freedom, no order, and authoritarianism, all order, no freedom.
Right.
And if America rejects the ordered freedom, we are going down clearly towards anarchy, and every time something's chaotic, you'll have more of a reach towards government, and we'll swing from anarchy back. That's what this is very relevant.
They one calls the other out of the darkness. Absolutely, that's the Tower of Babel story.
And they're both dark, right? I mean, in the tradition of political thinking, tyranny does not produce order. No. It produces disorder, right? And justice is the thing that produces order. Then each can have his place, and each can do what is right and command his own responsibilities. And so you disrupt that. I mean, do you think the Soviet Union was an orderly place?
Right.
It was a radically disorderly place. And the forms of disorder that come from freedom are suppressed, sort of, but that doesn't mean that there's not huge disorder underway all the time. Right. And remember, these people are seeking for lawfulness. And my opinion is that they start with the obvious things, and then and that gives meaning and plausibility to the whole thing. And after that, they get to 613 rules,
they differentiate,
which you would not derive from a knowledge of the natural law, right? But the rules are important because they mark them out. They're doing all this according to a plan that I have made, and for everybody.
And I think we should regard these two not as arbitrary constraints, but as enabling principles. They're like the rules of a game, and you think, well, are you more constrained if you play the game by the rules? It's like, well, no, because you wouldn't have the game without the rules. And so the rules are actually the precondition for freedom within the constraint of the game. Yeah. Shall we move to thou shalt not steal? We better do that. So that's the next one. So why not? Why not steal? Like what happens to social order? The first thing you might say is, well, if you can steal, then no one gets to have anything. Right? I mean, if I can just take what's yours at will, first of all, you're not going to work to get it, and so you won't get it because it usually takes work to get something. It's like,
that's what we're going to fight. I mean, we're just going to fight.
And then we're going to fight, and then we're back to the killing problem.
That's right, exactly.
So if I think this is why there has to be some tolerance for inequality as well. It's like, well, if you get to have things, then you also get to have some things I don't have. And I also think that allowing people to have things that you don't have is a precondition for wealth. Well,
and freedom.
And yes, exactly.
But I think that it's funny because the idea thou shalt not steal, that it's a complete universal, I'll be honest with you, I've lived in places where that is not the case. And the effects are astounding. I mean, the effects are crazy because nobody trusts anybody.
Exactly. And then the cost of any transaction approaches the infinite.
Exactly. And so then normal business becomes nearly impossible. Yeah. Trust becomes impossible. And you can see it is everybody against everybody.
Yes.
Basically.
By the way, a note of information, which I learned very early on, that do not steal, and this is not well known, and I think it should be, especially in light of slavery, is that the first aspect in Jewish understanding of do not steal is you may not steal a human being. It is certainly property. Yeah. So first and foremost is kidnapping. So,
is that in the...
That is the way it was understood. Rashi brings the point, the great medieval commentator that's considered normative, and it's in the Talmud, which is, a little past the time of Jesus.
There's a great economist named Hernando de Soto. I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he grew up in South America, and he put his mind to the question, why can't they produce and improve their society? And he came up with the answer, they don't own anything. And if you and like there aren't deeds and property line laws. And so he helped Peru in particular come up with some.
Yep.
And what he did was he got them to walk around the neighborhood and mark when the dogs barked.
Yep.
And draw a property line there. And that way now it's yours and you can do with it. And that's what's wrong with communism.
Yeah, because he objected, for example, in these tent cities that surround large developing countries. The problem isn't that people are poor because they have property.
They're prevented from becoming rich.
The problem is they don't have title or deed to the property, and so they can't capitalize it. And that's one of the things that makes De Soto's book so brilliant, is that he shows very clearly that he was trying to account for why, too, that if you just imported a Western legal system into a developing country, it didn't work because there was no bottom-up concordance with the law, and that was partly a consequence of people not having clear title ownership. When I was a kid, I used to go to this little town in Saskatchewan called Nacum, and one of the cool things about Nacum was it only had about 500 people. It was kind of a thriving town in the 1960s, 70s when I used to go there. It was before all the small towns collapsed. There was a dairy there where people got their milk in cartons, but there was no one in the store. And everyone just went to the store and took the milk in cartons, and then they put their money in the little till beside the cooler, and that's how the dairy serviced the town. And no one ever took the money. And I think, well, this is what we need to think about in the modern world when we think about what constitutes wealth. That was a wealthy community, right?
It was high in trust. And
trust is the fundamental commodity.
And so the respect for another person's property is respect for another person. It's a way of expressing neighborly regard and love in the end. I mean, I think the old sense of the word property, and when we think of it, this computer is my property, this mug is my property. The old sense is that what's proper or appropriate to a person. That is to say, what is it's an extension of them. You sometimes have kind of property in abstract ideas. I have a property in my freedom. I have property in my conscience. And so this is the sort of Lockean 18th century, as I think the founding fathers understood.
Well, John Locke.
That's right.
Life,
the original and property, not just material objects, but as it were, everything that is proper to myself.
Do you think
that's
that's
an
any
extension of
different
myself.
from Dennis's observation that the fundamental property to not be stolen is another person?
Yes,
because we do regard these things that we own as extensions of ourselves, and we do assume that we have a right to ourselves. I don't think it's exactly that we're our own property, because we don't have the right to treat ourselves in a manner that isn't appropriate to someone who fits within this subsidiary moral organization, right? We still have to accord to ourselves
the image of God.
Yeah, a certain dignity. But property seems to me to just be an extension of the person.
What is proper to the person?
Yes, exactly. So and of the existence of the dignified and sovereign self.
You realize how awful the early socialists were. I forgot the French socialist's name, but he's a who said
all property is theft.
Yes, all property is theft.
That's such a terrible statement.
It's truly the inversion of the Ten Commandments. If all property is theft, then clearly you can steal all property.
No, you're obliged to.
You are obliged to.
You're morally
even
obliged
better.
to.
Right now, as we speak, I hope one day this will be viewed as an interesting historical phenomenon, but right this moment in New York City, store after store is now placing shampoo behind locked windows. That is how much theft is going on
when
in
the
New York.
Soviets dekulakized the farms, the proposition essentially was all these farmers who'd clambered out of serfdom to some degree of prosperity were only prosperous in the minimum way they were prosperous because they had stolen that prosperity from their victimized neighbors. And so it wasn't only that it was okay to steal to take back that from the kulaks, but that it was a moral obligation to steal from those whose property was deemed to be theft. Right. unbelievably pathological, and it produced an unbelievably pathological outcome.
Which only intellectuals believed. I had to throw that in.
Luciferian rationalists, not intellectuals.
I love that. Forgive me 1 second. Is that your term?
Luciferian rationalist? I'll take credit for it
for now. That is awesome.
Yeah. Well, they're the rationalists who elevate rationality to the highest place. That's what makes them Luciferian.
I love it.
Right?
I love it.
In a way, these are the minimum conditions of any human community. I mean, if you're not alive, you're not allowed to live at all. You certainly can't participate. If you can't have a stable family, which is what adultery is protecting, both for the husband and wife trust, but also for the children's stability in relation to their parents. Then there's no family life. There's no perpetuating of human community. And if you can't, it is interesting that steel. It really is in this total way that Jonathan's saying. There is really very little meaningful or actual human activity that is not premised on not being stolen from. There's certainly no economic activity. There's no stability in the world in terms of owning anything. There's no incentive.
Hospitality.
There's no exchange. It's absolutely at
There's
the heart
certainly
of it all.
no investment in the future because, I mean, what happens to many cultures is that, and this is why perhaps why that 350,000 year period of human history produced almost no incremental improvement in living standard, is that if it is the case that as soon as you produce something of excess value that you could store, which would be property, because that's what property is, if someone can just come in and take it, that generally also means they kill you. Right? They kill you and they take your property. And so if the rule is anytime anyone produces something, you can just kill them and take it, the consequence of that is pretty soon no one produces anything.
And I think that amazingly brings us to the next one, which is thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, because that's a form of killing, right? If my speech is allowed to misrepresent what is real in relation to these fundamental, if I say you killed someone when you didn't, this is the ultimate condemnation of a kind of cancel culture, right? If I'm allowed to represent you with such untruth in the world that your life cannot continue, right? Because I'm representing you as having broken the commandment, for example.
Right.
Then you have nothing. So the truth in speech, as you so often say.
Well, that might be the critical issue there. So maybe the false witness issue comes in here because if I bear false witness on you, against you, what I'm essentially doing is suggesting that you violated one of these basic commandments. Right, so now the idea is, well, we have these commandments, we have to represent them in abstraction, that would be reputational, and now you're not allowed to make the claim that you violated this and damaged someone's reputation. And, I don't think, when we've talked in our culture a lot about virtue signaling, it's not exactly a great phrase, because really what you're trying to do when you virtue signal is you're trying to acquire reputation that you haven't earned. And the reason that people are so motivated to do that is because once you can abstract an ethic, there's actually nothing that's more valuable than your reputation, right? It's the thing upon which all the trades that you engage in with everyone else depends, right? You're as good as your reputation. And so if you can get that falsely, it's a real crime. And if you can savage it without cause, it's an equally egregious crime. And
worse,
that's why psychopaths do it
so
often, and so narcissists and
surely that's much
types.
worse, though, Jordan. To have an ill-gotten reputation, that's bad. But to take away someone's actually earned reputation, I know that there are, in a certain sense, two
it's
sides.
It's a battle between devils.
Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, they are. They're two sides of the same coin.
By the way, you'll find this fascinating. The 4 prohibitions: murder, adultery, stealing, and false witness. In certain circumstances, they are all capital offenses. And that's the reason they're in the 10 Commandments. So let me very quickly explain. Murder is obvious, life for a life, and only if it's premeditated. Adultery, which needs 2 witnesses, it never happened in reality that we know of, but nevertheless it is a capital offense under certain circumstances. Stealing, kidnapping is. Stealing property is not a capital offense. That's part of the way they know that it actually meant stealing a life. And the 4th one is one I love. In the Torah itself, this is not later, if you bear false witness, you are given the punishment that would have been meted out had you been believed. So that if I testify that you committed murder and I perjured myself, I am executed. I wish we had that law today, that you are given the punishment for perjury that would have been meted out had we believed you.
Well, part of what's
clean up the social media.
Well, part of what's
fast.
pathologized social media at the moment, and this is why I've been objecting to at least a certain kind of anonymity, is that you can cast out reputational aspersions at not only at zero cost, but you can monetize that. And that's really not, to me, what that indicates. I've talked to a bunch of psychologists about this recently because we've been looking at what personality attributes go along with online reputation savaging, let's say. And they're exactly what you'd expect. It's narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and sadism. And they just added sadism, the psychologists, in the last few years because the first three weren't quite bitter enough. And so we're in a situation, one of the things that virtualization does is enable the bearing of false witness, no punishment. And it means it's enabling the psychopaths. It's a very bad thing. So, all right, let's move to the next one. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. It's interesting first that this isn't just no killing, no murder. It's actually fairly detailed, and I think the reason for that is that in some sense, this is the most tempting and subtle of the terrible sins. And so it needs the most delineation. It's like, covet, why does that matter? I just want what you have. It's like, no, you don't understand. It really matters that you don't do that. And it matters so much, we're going to detail it. And I think part of the reason, too, again, is that if you're allowed to covet, if that's not regarded as a moral sin, then anything that your neighbor has attained that is more than you've attained, or anything that anyone's attained that's more than you have attained, or that anyone else has attained, is now fair game. And that means, well, that's the end of attainment as far as I can tell. That's the end of any differentiation of qualitative achievement, if you can covet. And I would say, I think the spirit of Marxism, in the most fundamental sense, is a covetous spirit. I really believe that. That's why envy. Property is theft. Envy, resentment. Absolutely. It is the Nietzsche's philosophy of, it is, ressentiment, exactly that. And Nietzsche did a lovely job of delineating that.
You take James's idea that it's all what's proper to us, you could almost say the commandments begin, no other gods. And in a sense, they end, no other goods. In other words, another man's wife or his property or whatever, that's his, not mine.
But just to press hard on this, though, and I think this comes back to the distinction Dennis is making between perhaps Christianity and Judaism. I mean, it's very clear. We've already covered you're not allowed to commit adultery, you're not allowed to steal. The coveting is totally internal act, is it not? So why is the coveting
Well, how does
forbidden?
that fit with what Dennis said?
Well, yeah.
Because, again, it's very important to understand, and it's the reason that it gives specifics. So let's use the specific. So I can say, you know, I would really like a woman like my neighbor's wife. That's not coveting. I want my neighbor's wife is coveting. I would like a house like my neighbor's house is not. It might be envy, it might be jealousy, it might be unhealthy, but it's not coveting. I want my neighbor's house is coveting.
So coveting is the desire to put it into action.
Which leads to stealing and adultery and murder. That's what I said. The 10th is the basis of the previous 4, and the 5th is the basis of the first 4.
So the word itself goes beyond desire, doesn't it?
Lachmod is
halfway beyond desire to action.
It's yearning for. But it's
so it's sort of like if I had the opportunity, I would do it.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And it's wanting that particular one then.
That particular one, exactly.
Right.
TPO.
Which you can't have unless you deprive the person, the owner of it.
But Dennis,
Well, so if you evaluate someone for suicide risk, here's how you do it. You know, you might say to someone who's depressed, do you ever think about suicide? And they say, well, now and then, you know, the idea enters my mind. You think, well, that's not indicative of risk. But if they say, well, you know, at home, my father keeps a .45 on the top shelf of the cabinet on the north wall, and the bullets are in the drawer on the left-hand side. And I've thought about going down there, and one day I, actually had that gun in my hand. You think, this person is on the edge, because they've concretized the temptation to the point where they've allied it with a very specific plan. And so I think what you're saying is that covetous is on the border between envy, as we said, is on the border between envy and action.
Envy.
The only thing that's stopping you is the opportunity.
That's correct. Or the illegality.
Right, which boils down to the same thing in some sense,
correct.
right? Yeah.
That's really important for people to know this.
But doesn't that
you forgive me? No. I feel bad. It's so, to me, because the reputation of the Ten Commandments sort of rests on this, because if we were banned, don't like or even want a wife like your neighbor's wife.
Right, because that can be an ambition.
That's right. Mm-hmm. I want to succeed so well, I will have a house like my neighbors. I will have a wife like my neighbors. That's not bad. Mm-hmm. But I want my neighbors, and then fill in the noun. That's bad.
Well, that's interesting, Dennis, because one of the things I see that really demoralizes young men in particular now is I think it's something like the casual confusion of ambition with covetousness. It's sort of the mere fact that you want something more than you have is an indication of your moral degeneration. And it's not, because we don't want to place striving towards an ideal in the same category as covetousness.
Theology, basically. So is, by the way, I don't know if you'll all agree with me, I defend, which is somewhat of funny, because Christmas is not my religious holiday, but it is my national holiday in America, and I love it for my country. But every year somebody will call in and go, the Pope or this religious leader or that came out against the culture of consumerism. And I go, so what? I just want to understand something. So people buying gifts for all of their friends and relatives on Christmas is a bad thing? Is that what you're saying? I defend that. It's like I defend ambition. These are good things. If you want to buy people that are important to you in your life a Christmas gift, why is that the culture of consumerism and not a beautiful thing?
I think it's when it's reduced. It's a problem of hierarchy, and so the consuming things is not wrong. But if Christmas becomes about consuming things,
if it's only
what are we doing?
Right,
what are we celebrating here?
Mm-hmm. Right, but
it's the subjugation of the highest
gifts and God are a good combo. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just for the record.
Mm-hmm. What's a good combo?
Gifts and God.
That's right.
I
agree with that.
And the Pope doesn't want them to be divorced, that's all. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want... Consumerism is a way of forgetting the gratuity of grace.
Yeah, but I would say most... And where I live,
that gift-giving symbolizes.
Where I live, nobody celebrates Christmas, really. I mean, they celebrate... I don't know exactly what they're celebrating, but they're getting
you mean in your
together
secular world?
Yeah.
I know.
They come together and they buy gifts for each other, and that's pretty much it.
When I was a kid,
they're celebrating the spirit of sacrificial exchange, at least. And that's something, right? It's something. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, there's an echo of that. There's an echo in there left. Yeah. And I think it's fragile.
But better than nothing.
Well, right. Better than nothing.
I miss decorations. It's one of my annual plea on my radio show is, please, if you celebrate Christmas, please put out lights or something in front of your house. Mm-hmm. To go down, do you know there, I live in L.A., which is a pretty secular place.
No. L.A., I'm shocked.
I knew you would be. I know. San Francisco is worse. That's my only consolation.
Yeah, there you go.
But I am convinced there are neighborhoods that have way more Halloween decorations than Christmas.
Yeah, that's 100%.
Which is, I think, a statement about the age in which we live.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if could touch on a second here, something Dennis was saying earlier, which is troubling me, and maybe this does strike at the heart of the difference between Christianity and Judaism, and I don't want to read the
difference.
I don't want a difference.
We have a lot that's in common.
I know, and I don't want to read the Ten Commandments here simply through the lens of the New Testament, where Jesus, says, for example, when he's talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, it's this kind of legalism So, oh no, I can't save your donkey that fell in the ditch because it's a Sabbath. So that sort of sense that you're keeping the law while breaking it in a deeper sense. What you were saying about covetousness being very specific and only pertaining to these three, it seems to me problematic because, surely at some level there is a spirit of keeping the law in addition to the law of keeping the law. And so, for example, and this is why I think what you're saying about pornography is problematic, because, okay, I can not ever kill someone, but surely I'm not in a good state if I'm spending all my time thinking about how I would do it if I did do it. That's.
But I wasn't asked about spending all your time. I was asking about it at all. And I gave circumstances in which I think God would forgive the individual, and as I gave the man married to the Alzheimer's wife who took care of her. See, here's the irony: if one is to say no, he should not even buy a magazine, or now that's antiquated. Look on the internet at any pictures and self-pleasure himself. Whereas he cannot get it from the wife that he is so taken care of. So if he divorced her while she had Alzheimer's, then they would say, oh, he can have sex now because he could remarry. So in a sense, the only legitimate sexual outlet would be divorcing the wife he's taking care of who has Alzheimer's. This is not an abstract situation. There are many people, God knows you know, and in a sense, I know because of my radio show. It's a sort of, in its own way, not a therapy session, but people open up to me. There's a lot of pain out there, and to say you cannot relieve your sexual tension even though you have no legit outlet to do so, I don't think we religious people come off well if we say that.
But I think from a Christian perspective, things are always taken in a balance, right? From Christ says, for those that have much is asked of, and those that have little, and so there's a sense in which to say that I can have compassion for someone in that situation is not to say that it's fine, and to say that I can have compassion for someone
fine or ideal,
or to say that I can have compassion for someone who was beaten by their parents their whole life and is taking drugs. And I was like, yeah, I get it. It's like, I understand why you're doing that. But I'm not going to say that the act is good in itself. That there is a way in which, like, you're on a scale, you're on a path. And that's why I brought out before. For Christians, it's a path towards transformation. So we recognize someone, you have a prostitute who's still a prostitute, but suddenly helps her neighbor and gives some of that money. That's a good thing.
So is masturbation, we have to talk about the reality. That's what you're asking. That's what pornography is about, essentially. Is that always wrong?
Without
looking at pictures. Without looking at pictures.
No, but in the Orthodox tradition, it is definitely.
Okay. All right.
But there's also a great compassion, because we all know that all of us struggle with the same desires. Yeah. So if I go to my priest and I confess something, it's like my priest has had the same struggle that I have. And so it's not about, oh, now you're going to hell because you did this. It's like, no, I'm carrying you.
I also think, Dennis, that it's self-evident, I think, that it's not an ideal. Like it's not something that people announce triumphantly or claim as a virtue, right? So, and so that
I understand.
Right. So
it needs to be excused by circumstances.
Right, but is drinking? You gave the great analogy of drink is okay, but not too much. Not if it owns you. Why can't that not be stated in the sexual arena? What is in the alcohol arena? Nobody brags about drinking. Well, that's not true. Some people are connoisseurs.
But nobody regards it as a moral virtue.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's right. And so why is the analogy that you gave not apt here?
I'm not necessarily claiming that it is. I do. Well, I think maybe part of it's an issue of the difficulty of fringe and border. It's like we are seeing, I think, a proclivity among young men and young women alike to shy away and detach themselves from actual intimate relationships. And I think part of that is...
Yes, it's become a crisis. There's no question.
Let's say on the incel front, there's all these men that are involuntary celibate because no women will take a second look at them. And there's a lot of resentment generated against women in consequence. And I think part of the reason that the incel phenomenon exists, there's many reasons, is that pornography provides an easy way out. And you might say, well, how desperate do you need to be to find a woman and stay with her? And the answer might be, it's so damn unlikely and difficult that you need every single thing inside you striving toward that end. And if you take the easy way out on any front, you're compromising that.
I 100% agree.
Well, so
100%.
You know, and I don't know how we square that with compassion. You know, I mean, I've looked at, like I had lots of people in my clinical practice who were very, very damaged people, and the probability that, for all sorts of reasons, the probability that they were going to find a functional, sustainable relationship was just zero, you know. And you can think about sex surrogates for people like that, like sex robots and all the gadgets that people use, and you think, well, is that a viable solution? I think that Jonathan's answer is part of that. It's like, well, you know, my God, if you were in that person's situation, you'd be hard-pressed to imagine that they could strive for a better outcome. And maybe the situation where you can't imagine that the person could possibly strive for a better outcome, then you have compassion. You say, well, that's the best you've got, buddy, and that's horrible, and it's certainly not ideal, but it's understandable. But that still leads us into this situation where you open up the door to that easy route, and I mean, pornography is a catastrophe as far as I can tell. Yeah, it entices women down a terrible route.
Listen, what is happening with kids being exposed to it early, it is a catastrophe. But you asked me point blank, and I know too many examples where people who are decent and even religious have no legit sexual outlet because of an infirmed spouse or a frigid spouse or whatever the reason might be. And I say, you should have no outlet. And maybe you're right.
Well, I mean, I think Larry earlier talked about the necessity for justice in the maintenance of genuine order. And we could add to that and tell me what you think about it. It's not just mercy, right? It's the balance, or justice. It's the balance between justice and mercy. And that's the two hands of God. And so if there's too much justice,
that's right,
then no one can survive. But if there's too much mercy, no one can survive either. And so we're trying to thread the needle here, and it's a very difficult thing to do. So
yeah, in the law, justice and equity. Equity is a way of recognizing some right that's beyond the narrow limits of the law.
Mm-hmm. Could I try to defend what I understand Jesus saying? You know, you hear Jesus saying, if anyone follows me, must hate his parents and so on. And Leon Cass, for example, says that's horrendous. But I think he's taking Jesus literally there, where I think he's saying, if you put me first, your love for me will make the other secondary. Yeah. And I think here, what he's saying is that adultery in action will grow from the heart. And I think that overlaps with this. And I've always understood...
With covetousness.
Isn't your Jewish word tzimtzum or something like that?
Limitation, yes.
In other words, freedom begins in the heart, and God will never invade our hearts. And that's where the Christian faith and Judaism overlap. And I think Jesus is saying, you know, where it goes wrong, it starts inside. It starts in the heart. Now, Luther tackles this, and he says, you know, we'll always fall short of the ideal. So he says, we're always sinners, always penitent, always justified, all at one and the same time. And that's what I like. I'll fail, but there's a difference between thinking about it and doing it.
So I have a theory that I'm honored to bounce off you. When you cited Jesus speaking about the Pharisees, let's say, not saving an animal that fell into a pit because it's working on the Sabbath. First of all, I believe they'd be violating Jewish law if they didn't save the donkey, because there's a Jewish law, Tsar Ba'alei Chayim, the pain of a living creature, and you must limit that. There are many Torah laws. You cannot muzzle an ox when it is in the field. However, I have a theory for you. I think that Jews, the great strength of Judaism and the great strength of Christianity like the great strengths in our individual lives, can often lead also to great problems. You're a particularly beautiful woman, it's a blessing, but it can come with a lot of prices, to give a simple example. So I think the great strength of Judaism has been its law. The great strength of Christianity has been faith. And I believe that both faith and law can be false gods.
Well, I also don't think we should assume that Jews are any more pharisaical, let's say, than Christians. Right? The Pharisees in this particular narrative are the legalists who take the Lord's name in vain in some real sense. Right? So we don't want to just identify the Pharisees with the law per se. It's a deeper critique than that. And the confusion on that front has led to no shortage of trouble. Let's continue with the story here. Okay, so we're done with the coveting.
And the commandments.
And the commandments. And so now we go back to the story. This is all pronounced.
But this would I think if we continue though, it's important because the next part is not the story. It's still instructions on worship. Because I think there's a microcosm here, which is that God gives the law, then tells people how to worship in a very summary way.
Okay.
And then we go into all the extended law, and then the tabernacle as this kind of extended worship.
So that's a bit of a prefiguration here. So jump in when you feel ready. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings. It's a nice narrative setup here because it dramatizes this so well. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings.
Saw thunderings.
And the noise of the trumpet.
They saw sound.
And the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. So they're awe-stricken by the power of the revelation of these principles. They're made explicit, right? And this is a huge step in human culture as well, right? Because now the implicit, at absolute minimum, the implicit has been made explicit. And that is a revelation in secular terms, right? It's an insight of remarkable magnitude, that now the principles that order us have become stateable and understandable. It's an amazing thing. And they said unto Moses, "Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die." And Moses said unto the people, "Fear not, for God is come to prove you, to test you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not." That's interesting to take apart, that his fear may be before your faces. That's akin to the idea that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And it means something like...
Yeah, it's awe.
Yeah, it's awe.
Awe is such a better word.
Yes. And to maintain yourself in proper relationship to that which is transcendent. That's partly what the narrative is trying to do here, is that the source of these principles is something extremely high, mighty, and worth being necessarily subservient to, even though you're in relationship to it. And when you forget that, that's when you're going to lose the terror that would otherwise orient you properly. In my clinical practice, one of the things I used to do with people when they were thinking about their positive future, I used to get them to lay out their negative future. It's like, okay, you've got a bunch of problems, and we've kind of laid them out. Let's develop a vision of the future where all those problems, your weaknesses, your temptations, they get the upper hand, and you let them take you over. It's like, what does it look like 5 years down the road? Everybody would think. First of all, everyone knows what that would look like, even though they never want to look at it. And you get people to delineate out that the consequences of deviating from that ideal in the direction they're tempted, then it's something that they hold as a properly orienting fear, right? Why shouldn't you wander off the path? Well, you won't get to where you're going. It's like, yeah, that's a good reason. How about wander off the path and see what sort of hell awaits you? That's a lot better orienting principle. It's like, I want to get somewhere for sure, and I definitely don't want to fall off the edges of the world. So, fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. So
this is a device that Shakespeare uses all the time. So if you read the passages after the murder of Duncan in Macbeth, There's storms and horses.
Nature responds.
Yeah, that's right. In other words,
forests move.
All testimony of the physical world says this was a horrid act, right? And, you know, Macbeth knows that. Beforehand, he imagines the demons crying for the blood of Duncan and the angels above crying out to spare his life. So one of my great teachers, we used to listen to Shakespeare plays, and he picked up the needle at this point and says, does this man not live in a richly populated moral universe? You see, and that's what this passage is. These things are cosmic in their significance.
Yeah. And one senses it's an appropriate response on from the Israelites, a kind of awe.
Yeah, well,
fear,
I would say too,
silence.
phenomenologically, certainly this was the experience, again, of my clientele, and I think it's my personal experience too. If you are tempted to wander into dark places, everything around you turns dark, right? That's reflected in the manner in which the world begins to manifest itself to you. And so I don't know exactly how that speaks of the concordance between the moral order and the benevolence of transcendent reality itself, but those things are by no means easily separable. So, and practically speaking,
as John said, though, this is the prelude to the tabernacle and the meeting place.
Because what I want to point out is that there's a structural thing happening. Because people talk about how stories get repeated, but I think there's always a good reason why they're being repeated.
Shall I read right to the end then? And
let me. I can point it out, and as we go,
do you want to read through it then?
I think that's fine.
Okay.
What I just want to point out is that just before the law, the same thing happened, where it's like God is this thundering thing above that's firing a cloud, and it's like terrifying. And we have to stay away, don't touch the mountain, don't touch anything, because it'll kill you. And so it's like this radical separation, right? God is so high, God is transcended beyond everything. And here we are, and we're basically in danger of dying, facing this absolute. And then God says, okay, here's the law. Here's the mediating principle which will connect us together. Here's your vertical relationship. Here's the horizontal relationship. Now we get the same image. It's like, okay, God's thundering on the mountain and everybody's frightened, everybody's pulling back. And now God is going to say, now this is how you worship me.
So this is how you can approach me.
This is the manner in which now we're going to enter into relationship in a ritual way. So there's the moral way and the ritual way that come one after the other. And
but isn't there a simple part in what you're saying? Moses is able to take God immediately, and the people are blown away.
Yeah.
So they need intermediate ways, and that's what's coming.
Yeah, well, one of the things Jung said about...
When Moses is missing, they go for the golden calf.
That's right, yeah.
Right. One of the things Jung said about religious practice, he said, part of the purpose of religious practice is to stop people from having religious experiences. And he came to that conclusion from dealing with people who were schizophrenic, who were overwhelmed by the transcendent in some. They were overwhelmed by the transcendent. They were fractured by a series of revelations within that they couldn't control, right? That unmediated encounter with the source of revelation can blow you into pieces. So, all right. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. It's an interesting place for God to be. And the Lord said unto Moses, thus thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, ye have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. Ye shall not make with me gods of silver, neither shall you make unto you gods of gold. An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings and thy peace offerings, thy sheep and thine oxen. In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone, for if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go up by steps unto mine altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered thereon. All right, so that's complex. So we can walk through this. You shall not make with me gods of silver, you shall not make unto you gods of gold. So you can't take even the highest forms of material reality, silver and gold in particular, and use that as a replacement for God.
And in some ways what it is, it's still setting up an above and below. It's saying actually, in order for the highest to manifest itself, you have to gather something from below which is pure, which is untouched, which hasn't been cut by anybody. It's similar to when God is telling the people before, like, clean yourself, don't sleep with your wives. It's like, purify yourself. Be untouched, be unworked, so that I can come and manifest myself on this. So this idea that the first image of worship is this uncut altar of uncut stone.
It's like potential.
No technology.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Pre-technology.
No technology.
No craftsmanship.
Exactly.
I see.
Yeah.
So you're not going to put an intermediation of technology between you and the altar.
In this case, right, later we'll see how God then fills that mediation of technology too. But in this case, it's almost like the first image is this altar of uncut stone, and then this is how God will how the fire of the sacrifice will go up to God on this.
So is that a return to the pre-cosmogonic chaos? Is that a...
I would say it's a return to the garden more.
Yeah,
it's a return to
pre-civilization.
Fine.
No, Cass's idea comes in here. You've got the two contrasts. You either want to master nature, Babylon, Babel, that's your gold idols, or you want to merge with nature, the frenzy of the Canaanite worship and the sexual fertility. And there's a simple modesty of this, uncut stones and so on. So again, I think you have the contrast with Egypt and with the country they're going to, Canaan.
We're not shaping the stone, but we're not worshipping it either.
Neither shalt thou go up by steps unto mine altar, that thy nakedness not be discovered. They're on that at the moment.
Don't look at me. That's the one I don't understand.
That's the Canaanite. The priests used to get into it with frenzy and take off their clothes. Take Apollo and Diana.
The desexualization of religion is one of the great achievements of the.
But why go up
Bible.
by steps? That's the one I don't understand. I understand the nakedness not be discovered.
Is that
what's
part of
with
the
steps?
Would that not involve technology and
going
cutting
up,
and
maybe?
shaping?
He's saying, build the altar and don't go up. I don't totally get that.
Okay, well, we're obviously missing one person at the table who has the key to this particular verse.
This is Nietzsche's Apollo, is the mastery, and Dionysus is the chaos and frenzy.
How do you relate that? Is there a way of relating that?
They're wearing robes.
The uncovered God.
I think that might be right, yeah.
So they're saying, like, if you go up steps, then people will stand here and can see up your robe. Something like that. Yeah, it seems a bit trite, but I don't know.
No. I think
the higher the monkey climbs, the more you can see his tail. That's a Tom Waits song. I wonder if that's the same kind of idea here. So, all right.
I'm sure some biblical scholar can write it in the comments.
Okay.
No, that...
Dennis is silent.
That sounds like...
Well, no, I don't have a comment on the steps, except that was probably the way many of the temples were built. But the nakedness, you have commented on correctly, and I just checked my own commentary to see if I forgot something that I wrote. But no, it is about the sexualization of religion.
All right, here's a possibility. Maybe neither shalt thou go up by steps unto mine altar. So imagine that as you do that, you elevate yourself towards God. That's the idea.
But when Moses went up the mountain, that's what happened. Like,
right,
Moses
but
goes up the mountain.
He was called to go up.
He was called.
He was called to go up. So maybe this has to do with falsely elevating yourself, because that would make sense that your nakedness that would then be discovered, because it is the case that if you're corrupt, the more you elevate yourself, the more that corruption becomes revealed.
Because if we were in Jerusalem and we saw, the tabernacle is not the same. The tabernacle leads to the temple, and the temple is on a mount. It's at the top of a mountain, and so there's a joining of this symbolism of the mountain of Moses and the tabernacle in that sense. And so people are going up towards the. So there's probably
the steps are an artificial mountain, though. So I think this means something like, don't falsely elevate yourself. So at least that's a possibility. All right, well, gentlemen, it happens to be exactly 2 hours after we've embarked upon today's adventure, and we're exactly at the end of this, so that's very nice timing. And so maybe that means we're in the right place doing the right thing. Wouldn't that be lovely? And so For everyone who's watching and listening, thank you very much to the Daily Wire Plus folks who facilitated this discussion. Our appreciation to all of you who've participated so eloquently today. It's much appreciated. I always learn plenty when I sit and listen to you guys talk. And so onward and upward to session 11 of the Exodus seminars tomorrow.
Testament.